On the evening of 31 March 1922, 6 members of the Gruber family were killed at the remote Hinterkaifeck farmstead near Gröbern in Bavaria. Their bodies were not discovered until 4 days later. By that time, someone had remained on the property feeding livestock, stoking the furnace, and moving through the house. If you value carefully reconstructed historical cases told without exaggeration, consider subscribing. Some crimes do not end when the killing stops. Hinterkaifeck was an isolated agricultural holding situated between the towns of Schrobenhausen and Ingolstadt. The nearest neighbors lived hundreds of meters away. In 1922, rural Bavaria operated through tightly knit farming communities where strangers were noticed and routine was predictable. The residents of the farm were Andreas Gruber, aged 63, his wife Cecilia, 72, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabrielle, 35, Victoria's daughter Cecilia, 7, her son Joseph, aged 2, and the family's new maid Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived only hours before the killings. The farm had already experienced unusual disturbances in the days leading up to the murders. Andreas Gruber reportedly discovered footprints in the snow leading from the forest toward the farmyard. He stated that no corresponding tracks led back toward the woods. He also mentioned hearing unexplained noises in the attic and finding a newspaper that did not belong to the household. These accounts were later documented during the investigation. On the evening of 31 March, the family went about their normal routines. What occurred next was reconstructed from the crime scene. 4 victims, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia, were found in the barn. They had been killed with a mattock, a farming tool similar to a hoe with a heavy blade. The positioning of the bodies suggested that they had been drawn into the barn individually rather than attacked simultaneously. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, was found in her bed in the house. The 2-year-old Joseph was located in his crib in the bedroom. All 6 victims had suffered fatal blows to the head. The weapon was later discovered hidden beneath loose boards in the attic. It belonged to the farm. What distinguished Hinterkaifeck from other rural homicides was not only the brutality, but what followed. After the killings, someone remained at the farmstead for several days. The livestock had been fed. Bread had been cut in the kitchen. Smoke was seen rising from the chimney by passing neighbors. A mechanic who visited on 1 April to repair a food chopper reported encountering no sign of distress. The bodies were not discovered until 4 April 1922, when neighbors became concerned after the young Cecilia failed to attend school and the family did not appear at Sunday services. A search party entered the property and located the victims. Money inside the house was left untouched. Valuable items remained in place. There was no evidence of robbery. The Bavarian police initiated an extensive investigation. Hundreds of individuals were questioned in the months and years that followed. Several suspects emerged, including neighbors and individuals connected to Victoria Gabriel's past. None were conclusively charged. The remoteness of the farm complicated early investigative efforts. Communication between rural authorities and central offices was limited. Forensic science in 1922 lacked the capacity for detailed trace analysis. Although the skulls of the victims were removed during autopsy for examination, they were later lost, likely destroyed during the Second World War. The murders quickly became a subject of national attention within Germany. Newspapers reported extensively on the isolation of the farm and the possibility that the killer had remained among the victims' bodies. The crime appeared methodical. The sequence suggested knowledge of the property and its routines. Yet no outsider was definitively identified. Hinterkaifeck would become one of Germany's most enduring unsolved cases, not because there were no theories, but because none were proven. The official investigation extended for years. Leads were revisited repeatedly, confessions were obtained and later retracted. Each line of inquiry dissolved under scrutiny. The farm was eventually demolished in 1923. The land was cleared, the physical structure disappeared. The record did not. What remains is a documented sequence, a rural household, a night of violence and days of silent occupancy by someone who was never formally identified. When the bodies were discovered on 4 April 1922, responsibility for the investigation fell to the Bavarian State Police in Munich, supported by local authorities in Schrobenhausen. The crime scene presented both clarity and complication. The weapon had been located, the victims' positions were recorded, yet the delay between the murders and their discovery had already compromised the integrity of the site. Villagers, neighbors, and curiosity seekers had entered the property before investigators secured it. The barn floor had been disturbed, objects had been moved. The contamination would later limit evidentiary certainty. Autopsies confirmed that all 6 victims died from blunt force trauma to the head inflicted by a mattock. The order of death was reconstructed cautiously. Investigators concluded that the 4 barn victims were likely killed first, drawn one by one into the structure. The maid and the child in the house were killed afterward. The precision of this sequence could not be absolutely established, but the spatial arrangement supported that interpretation. Attention turned immediately to individuals with proximity to the farm. One of the first persons questioned was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer. He had previously been romantically involved with Victoria Gabriel. There had been public speculation within the community regarding the paternity of Victoria's son, Joseph. Schlittenbauer acknowledged past disputes with the family, but denied involvement in the murders. Investigators examined his movements on the night of 31 March and in the days following. Witnesses placed him in the area during the search on 4 April. Some later testimonies suggested that he appeared unusually familiar with the barn layout when the bodies were found. However, such impressions were subjective and not supported by physical evidence. Schlittenbauer was interrogated multiple times. His statements were reviewed for inconsistencies. Though suspicion persisted locally, no material proof connected him directly to the killings. He was never formally charged. Another avenue of inquiry involved former employees and itinerant laborers. The rural economy of 1922 Bavaria included transient workers who moved between farms. Police canvassed neighboring districts, seeking individuals who had recently departed without explanation. Several names surfaced, none produced conclusive links. The reported attic noises and unexplained footprints in the snow were re-examined during interviews. Andreas Gruber had mentioned these disturbances days before the murders. Police considered whether someone had been hiding on the property prior to the attack. The absence of return footprints remained puzzling, but could not be conclusively verified due to thawing conditions and the passage of time. Investigators also evaluated the family's internal history. Andreas Gruber had previously been convicted in 1915 of incest with his daughter Victoria. The conviction had resulted in imprisonment. This history introduced additional tension within the household and expanded the pool of potential motives. Yet motive alone did not establish perpetration. Financial review revealed no immediate monetary incentive. Cash remained inside the house. Farm assets were intact. Insurance policies did not present clear gain for any one individual. The absence of theft distinguished the crime from opportunistic rural violence. In the months that followed, police pursued reports of suspicious strangers in nearby villages. Descriptions varied. Some witnesses claimed to have seen unfamiliar men along forest paths. Others recalled hearing rumors of vagrants seeking shelter. Each report was documented, and most were dismissed upon verification of alibis. Interrogation methods of the period relied heavily on repetition and cross-checking testimony. Written statements were compared against previous versions. In certain instances, suspects provided partial admissions under pressure, only to retract them later. None of these confessions survived scrutiny. The case extended beyond local jurisdiction. Bavarian authorities requested assistance from neighboring police districts. Bulletins describing the murders were circulated, yet without distinctive identifying evidence such as a unique weapon trace or verified eyewitness, the investigation remained circumstantial. In 1923, forensic examination included the removal of the victims' skulls for further analysis. This step reflected early 20th century efforts to determine precise wound patterns. However, advancements in forensic science were limited. Microscopic trace comparison and blood typing were still developing disciplines. The retained skulls were eventually lost, likely destroyed during the Second World War, eliminating the possibility of modern re-examination. Over the next several years, investigative focus narrowed repeatedly to Schlittenbauer. Rumors within the community persisted. He faced social ostracism and civil litigation related to the farm's estate. Yet prosecutors declined to indict without physical corroboration. The Hinterkaifeck property was demolished in 1923. A new structure was built nearby. The removal of the original buildings ended the possibility of further scene analysis. From that point forward, the investigation relied entirely on records, witness statements, and preserved documentation. By the late 1920s, official activity slowed. Leads diminished. Files accumulated but yielded no prosecutable case. Subsequent reviews occurred intermittently, including re-examinations in the 1930s and later in the 1950s. Each review revisited familiar suspects and recurring theories. None resulted in formal charges. The escalation phase of the investigation revealed the structural limits of raw criminal inquiry in early 20th century Germany. Isolation hindered immediate response. Community rumor complicated objectivity. Forensic capability constrained proof. The killings at Hinterkaifeck were not ignored. They were pursued extensively. Yet pursuit without resolution became the defining characteristic of the case. What remained unsettled was not the sequence of death, but the identity of the individual or individuals responsible. Suspicion gravitated toward familiarity rather than intrusion. Still, familiarity did not equal evidence. By late 1922, the Hinterkaifeck murders had shifted from active field investigation to structured review. Authorities had interviewed hundreds of individuals. They had reconstructed timelines, examined property records, and interrogated principal suspects repeatedly. Yet the case encountered a central barrier. Suspicion was plentiful. Prosecutable evidence was not. Lorenz Schlittenbauer remained the most scrutinized individual. His prior relationship with Victoria Gabriel provided motive in the eyes of many villagers. He had been involved in disputes concerning paternity and financial responsibility. After the murders, he participated in the discovery of the bodies and was among those who entered the barn. Some later accounts described him as moving confidently through the structure during the search, allegedly approaching the bodies without visible hesitation. These impressions, however, were derived from recollections that evolved over time. No contemporaneous record establishes that he possessed exclusive knowledge of the scene prior to its discovery. Police interrogated Schlittenbauer on multiple occasions. His statements were compared against witness testimony. He denied involvement consistently. No physical trace, no blood evidence, weapon link, or eyewitness confirmation placed him at the farm on the night of 31 March in a manner sufficient for indictment. Prosecutors determined that suspicion alone could not sustain a charge. Other individuals entered the investigative orbit. Former farm workers, transient laborers, and men previously accused of violent offenses were examined. In certain cases, suspects provided partial confessions under questioning. These statements collapsed under verification. Timelines did not align. Physical details contradicted narrative claims. The public narrative of the case developed independently of formal procedure. Newspapers emphasized the isolation of the farm and the suggestion that the killer remained on the property after the murders. Reports described livestock being tended and meals consumed in the days following the crime. This detail captured public imagination and reinforced the perception of calculated boldness, yet the evidentiary barrier persisted. There were no reliable fingerprints preserved from the scene. Blood analysis was limited to visual observation. Footprints in the snow, originally reported by Andreas Gruber before the murders, could not be forensically matched to any individual once investigators arrived. The barn itself offered limited clues. The mattock, discovered concealed in the attic, was a farm implement belonging to the household. Its presence established familiarity but not identity. The killer had used an available tool rather than introducing a distinctive weapon. Legal authorities faced a procedural threshold. German criminal law required demonstrable linkage between suspect and act. Motive, rumor, or community suspicion did not satisfy that standard. Without direct evidence, prosecutors declined to proceed. In 1923, the farmstead was demolished. The destruction of the physical structure ended the possibility of further spatial analysis. It also signaled an informal transition. The crime scene was no longer available for re-examination. Investigative review would henceforth rely entirely on documentation. Over the following years, case files were revisited intermittently. New tips were evaluated. Anonymous letters were received and assessed. Each iteration returned to the same structural limitation. No new material evidence emerged. The political landscape of Germany shifted dramatically during the 1930s. Administrative continuity was disrupted. Records were archived, transferred, and in some cases destroyed during wartime conditions. Portions of the original investigative files were lost, further narrowing the possibility of later forensic reconstruction. Despite the absence of prosecution, the case continued to circulate within regional memory. Villagers debated potential culprits privately. Families maintained inherited suspicions, yet these narratives existed outside the judicial record. Post-war re-examinations in the 1950s and later decades applied updated analytical frameworks to surviving documents. Investigators reassessed testimony, revisited timelines, and reconsidered suspects such as Schlittenbauer in light of new interpretive standards. These reviews acknowledged inconsistencies but uncovered no decisive evidence. The structural confrontation in the Hinterkaifeck case was therefore not a courtroom battle. It was a sustained encounter between suspicion and proof. Each suspect was weighed against available documentation. Each theory was measured against material trace. The process yielded hypotheses, but no indictment. In criminal justice, absence of resolution does not equate to absence of effort. The Bavarian authorities pursued the case extensively by the standards of their time. Yet investigative capacity in 1922 lacked tools that later generations would consider foundational. Preserved biological samples, advanced trace comparison, centralized databases. The enduring tension of Hinterkaifeck lies in its evidentiary incompleteness. The sequence of murders is understood. The identities of the victims are documented. The approximate time frame is established. What remains absent is the final connective proof linking one individual to the act. The case entered public consciousness not through a dramatic trial, but through its refusal to produce one. No defendant stood before a court. No verdict was rendered. No formal narrative was affirmed under oath. As decades passed, the farm's demolition did not erase the questions. Instead, it removed the physical anchor and left only the record. That record, though incomplete, remains detailed enough to reconstruct events, but insufficient to assign responsibility conclusively. In 1923, 1 year after the murders, the Hinterkaifeck farmstead was demolished. The buildings where 6 people had been killed were dismantled, and a new structure was constructed nearby. The decision was practical rather than symbolic. The property required restoration for agricultural use. Yet the demolition had a lasting consequence. It permanently removed the original crime scene from further examination. By that point, investigators had exhausted the most immediate lines of inquiry. Interviews had been conducted across neighboring districts. Suspects had been questioned repeatedly. Physical evidence had been catalogued to the extent possible under early 20th century forensic standards. Still, no indictment had been issued. The skulls of the victims, removed during autopsy in 1923 for additional examination, were preserved for a period of time. Their purpose was to allow further analysis of wound patterns and potential weapon characteristics. However, these remains were later lost, likely destroyed during the Second World War. Their disappearance eliminated the possibility of modern forensic reassessment using contemporary techniques, such as DNA analysis. The investigative files themselves did not remain fully intact. Bavaria, like much of Germany, experienced administrative disruption during the war years. Portions of the original police records were damaged or destroyed. What survives today consists of partial documentation, later summaries, and archival fragments preserved in regional repositories. In the decades following the murders, periodic reviews were conducted. In the 1930s, authorities revisited key suspects. After the Second World War, renewed efforts were made to reconstruct the case using surviving records. In the 1950s, additional interrogations were carried out with individuals who had been present during the original discovery of the bodies. These later examinations reflected advancements in investigative methodology, but they remained constrained by the absence of preserved physical evidence. Without the original crime scene, without biological samples, and without intact forensic materials, reanalysis depended primarily on witness recollection. By mid-century, such recollections were decades old. The Schlittenbauer continued to occupy a central place in public suspicion until his death in 1941. He consistently denied involvement. Though local rumor persisted, no formal charges were ever brought against him. His case illustrates the distinction between communal belief and judicial proof. Suspicion may endure socially long after legal proceedings have ended. Other individuals proposed in later decades were evaluated against the surviving record. Some theories suggested itinerant offenders. Others posited internal family dynamics, extending beyond what had been documented. Each theory encountered the same barrier: insufficient corroborating evidence. The Hinterkaifeck murders gradually transitioned from active investigation to historical case study. In Bavaria, the crime became embedded in regional memory. Articles, books, and documentaries revisited the events, often emphasizing the isolation of the farm and the fact that someone had remained there after the killings. The detail that livestock were fed and smoke was seen rising from the chimney in the days following 31 March 1922 became central to the case's legacy. It suggested composure and familiarity rather than impulsive flight. Yet even this detail, documented in witness statements, cannot be tied conclusively to a named individual. The absence of theft continues to complicate motive analysis. Money remained in the house. The farm's assets were not stripped. If financial gain was not the objective, the rationale may have been personal. However, personal motive requires identifiable conflict. While tensions existed within the Gruber household and between Victoria Gabriel and certain neighbors, none translated into prosecutable evidence. The Hinterkaifeck case endures not because it lacks structure, but because its structure is incomplete at the final step. The sequence of events is known with reasonable clarity. The family was killed on the evening of 31 March 1922. The bodies were discovered on 4th April. The killer likely remained temporarily on the property, and the weapon belonged to the farm. What remains unknown is the identity of the person who committed the act. In criminal justice history, unsolved cases often fade when evidence is minimal. Hinterkaifeck differs because the documentary record is substantial. Investigators worked diligently. Witnesses were interviewed in large numbers. Suspects were interrogated repeatedly. The case did not collapse due to indifference. It reached the limits of available proof. The demolition of the farm removed the physical environment. The destruction of forensic materials removed the potential for later technological reassessment. The loss of files narrowed archival completeness. Each stage reduced the possibility of resolution. Yet the murders have never been officially closed in a conclusive sense. The Bavarian authorities did not identify a perpetrator, and no judicial determination was made. The case remains open in the historical record. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck rests in its demonstration of investigative boundaries. It illustrates how rural isolation, early forensic limitations, and delayed discovery can converge to prevent final certainty. It also reflects the enduring human inclination to assign narrative completion where evidence refuses to provide it. The farm no longer stands. The forest paths have changed. The generation that lived beside Hinterkaifeck has long since passed. What persists are documented facts, preserved testimonies, and the unresolved final question. Some crimes are remembered for their trials, others for their verdicts. Hinterkaifeck is remembered for its absence of both. The record ends where proof ends, and that boundary remains, more than a century later, unaltered.